They made her pick up her own file off the gravel, on her knees, in front of 23 men who had already decided she didn't belong. She didn't move. Not 1 inch. Fort Blackstone's most feared marksman course had stood for 32 years. 16 instructors, 1 record, 0 women who had ever graduated at the top. Sergeant Elena Cross wasn't there to graduate. She was there to bury the record so deep nobody would ever find it again. And the man who tried hardest to destroy her? He had no idea what was coming. If this story already has you hooked, stay with me until the very end. Hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The gravel at Fort Blackstone was the kind that bruised through boot leather. Elena Cross had been awake since 0400, standing in the dark outside the main administration building with a duffel bag at her feet and a set of orders in her hand that 3 separate officers had tried to lose before they finally reached her. The drive from her last posting had taken 11 hours. She had eaten a gas station sandwich somewhere around hour 6 and hadn't touched water since the state line. Her back ached in a specific way she had learned to ignore. The deep, grinding kind that lived below the kidneys and above the hips and showed up every time she spent too long in a vehicle seat not designed for someone her height. She was 5'6". The seat had been built for someone closer to 6'2". Small indignities, she had survived larger ones. The base was just beginning to exhale from its nighttime stillness. Lights came on in the windows of the barracks one by one, amber squares punching through the black. The smell of diesel and pine and something metallic that she recognized as gun oil drifted across the yard. Fort Blackstone wasn't a big installation. It didn't need to be. The land around it did the heavy lifting. 8,000 acres of canyon country, ridge lines, broken terrain, and high desert wind that switched directions without warning and made precision shooting feel like an argument with the atmosphere itself. She had read everything about this place before she arrived. She had read the record too. 1,430 meters, 1 shot. Steel plate, half the size of a standard B-27 target. Red Falcon Canyon. The record had stood since 1992, set by a master sergeant named Dayton Rourke, who had since retired to a ranch somewhere in Montana, and who, according to an article she'd found in a regional military publication, kept a framed photograph of the canyon on his living room wall. She had folded that article into the back of the notebook she carried everywhere. The notebook had belonged to her father. She didn't open it often. Footsteps crunched behind her. She didn't turn. Cross. The voice belonged to a staff sergeant named Pollard. She'd seen his name on the duty roster posted outside the gate. Mid-30s. The kind of build that suggested he had once been very fast and was now merely very strong. He stopped 2 feet behind her left shoulder, which told her something about how he had been trained to approach people he wasn't sure of yet. "Sergeant Pollard," she said, without turning. A pause. "How'd you know it was me?" "Cadence. You favor your right hip slightly. Probably an old injury." She finally turned. He was looking at her the way people looked at something they hadn't expected to find where they found it. "You're early. Colonel wants the incoming class assembled at 0530. He glanced at her duffel bag. "Processing isn't open until 0600. "I know. So you've just been standing here?" "Yes." He looked at her for another moment, then at the orders in her hand, then back at her face. Something moved behind his eyes. Not hostility exactly, more like calculation. He had been here long enough to know what happened to people the colonel decided to make examples of. "Good luck," he said, and it didn't sound like a pleasantry. She turned back to face the dark outline of the canyon in the distance. "Thanks," she said. By 0530, the formation had assembled on the main training ground, a wide concrete apron bordered on 3 sides by steel equipment racks, weapon lockers, and the kind of institutional lighting that made everyone look slightly ill. 23 candidates stood in 2 rows. Elena positioned herself at the end of the second row, where she had a clean line of sight to the front and could observe the full group without turning her head. She spent the first 90 seconds cataloging. 12 of the 23 carried themselves with the specific stillness of people who had been through selection pipelines before. The posture wasn't rigid, it was settled, the way soldiers looked when they had stopped needing to prove they belonged and had simply started existing inside the space. 8 looked eager in a way that would become a liability within 2 weeks. 2 looked scared and were hiding it well. 1, a broad-shouldered captain near the front of the first row, was watching her the way she was watching everyone else, which was interesting. She filed that away. Colonel Victor Hale arrived at 0532. He was not a physically imposing man. That was the first thing she noticed. He was compact, gray at the temples, with a face that had been weathered into something angular by years of outdoor exposure. He wore no rank insignia on his training uniform, a deliberate choice, she suspected, to make candidates work out his authority through behavior alone rather than a quick glance at his collar. He walked across the concrete apron with his hands clasped at the small of his back, and he looked at the assembled candidates the way a quality control inspector looked at a line of parts, professionally, impersonally, and with the baseline assumption that something was about to fail. His eyes moved across the formation. They landed on her and stayed. He walked slowly down the front row, then the back row. He stopped in front of a candidate named Sergeant Torres and examined the alignment of his kit for 30 seconds without speaking. He moved on. He stopped in front of a candidate named Lieutenant Webb and asked him quietly to state the ballistic coefficient of the round currently loaded in the rifle on his back. Webb answered. Hale didn't respond, just moved on. He stopped in front of Elena. She looked straight ahead. Hale reached into the breast pocket of his uniform jacket and withdrew a manila folder. He held it at his side for a moment, then dropped it. The pages scattered across the gravel in a loose, windswept arc: personnel evaluations, qualification scores, a deployment summary, a photograph that landed face up and showed Elena in a uniform from 3 years ago. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. "Candidate Cross," Hale said. His voice was completely level. Not angry, not theatrical, just flat. "Collect your file." She could feel 22 pairs of eyes on the back of her neck. She did not look down at the pages. She did not look at Hale. She looked at a fixed point on the canyon wall in the distance and said, calmly and without inflection, "Sir, I'd be glad to collect my file when I have a free hand." The silence that followed lasted 4 full seconds. Hale looked at her hands. Her left hand held nothing. Her right hand held her assignment orders, folded precisely in half. "Put the orders down," he said. "They're government documents, sir. I'd need a flat surface." Another silence. Longer. Hale bent down slowly, collected every scattered page himself, stacked them without hurrying, slid them back into the folder, and tucked the folder under his arm. His face showed nothing. He moved on to the next candidate as if nothing had happened. But Elena had seen it, the micro-movement at the corner of his jaw when he bent to pick up the first page. A small, reflexive tightening. The kind of thing that happened when something landed differently than expected. She stored that too. Detroit. The first week at Fort Blackstone was designed to separate people from their comfort and their certainty in roughly equal measure. The daily schedule ran from 0430 to 2100, with irregular sleep disruptions built in on nights 2 and 4, not because sleep deprivation was the point, but because the instructors wanted to observe what candidates did when they were exhausted and still had to perform. The first 2 days were weapons familiarization, though calling it familiarization was generous, since the sessions were really extended observations of how candidates handled equipment under time pressure. Day 3 introduced the physical qualification series, obstacle courses, forced marches with weight, timed sprints across broken terrain. Day 4 was the first live fire evaluation. Elena finished the obstacle course on day 311, seconds faster than the next candidate. She said nothing about it. That evening, she sat at the cleaning bench in the armory and took apart her assigned rifle the way she always did when she arrived somewhere new. Not because the weapon needed it, but because the process helped her think. She broke it down to the bolt carrier group, laid every component on a clean cloth in the sequence she'd memorized at 16 years old in her father's garage, and examined each piece under a small headlamp. The rifle was a Macmillan TAC, 338, chambered for .338 Lapua. Magnum. Military issue, but with a quality trigger assembly that suggested the armorer here actually knew what he was doing. She ran the bore with a clean patch, examined the throat for wear, checked the feed ramp. Standard. She moved to the scope. A Nightforce ATACR, solid glass, clean turrets. She was about to reassemble when the bench lamp on her left clicked on. She didn't look up. "You run the course today like you've run it before," the voice said. She looked up. The broad-shouldered captain from the formation that morning. Up close, she could see he was about 35, with the kind of face that didn't waste effort on expression. His name tape read Cole. "I haven't," she said, "but terrain is terrain." Cole sat down on the bench across from her, uninvited, which she noted but didn't comment on. He set his own rifle case on the table and opened it without rushing. "Where'd you run before?" he asked. "Everywhere they'd send me." "And they sent you here?" "Yes." He glanced at her disassembled components, then back at his own rifle. "You didn't react this morning, when he dropped the file." "No." "Most people would have." "Most people would," she agreed. He was quiet for a moment, threading a boar brush. "I've been through 2 other selection pipelines. Neither CO pulled something like that on day 1. He looked at her directly. "What did you do to get his attention before you even arrived?" She looked at him evenly. "I arrived." Cole held her gaze for a moment, then looked back at his rifle. He didn't say anything else for the next 20 minutes, but he didn't leave either, and that told her something about him that she found useful. The live fire evaluation on day 4 took place at the 500-meter range. It should have been straightforward. Candidates were given 5 rounds, a standard IPSC target, and 4 minutes. The metric was simple: group size under 3 inches, no rounds outside the scoring zone. For a course of this level, 500 meters was the baseline, a minimum threshold, not a test of real capability. Elena settled into position at lane 7. Wind was reading at 4 to 6 knots from the northwest, gusting occasionally to 8. Standard condition. She dialed her scope, confirmed her dope card, settled her breathing. She fired 5 rounds in 2 minutes and 40 seconds. When the targets were retrieved and the instructors walked the line, the group that came back on her target stopped 2 of them mid-conversation. 3 inches was the standard. Her group measured slightly under 1.5 inches, centered exactly on the X-ring. Sergeant Pollard, running the line evaluation, stared at the target for a moment, then wrote something on his clipboard. She didn't see what he wrote. That afternoon, the official scores were posted on the barracks bulletin board. Her evaluation listed a group size of 3.2 inches. She stood in front of the board for exactly 4 seconds, reading the number. Then she took out a small notebook, not her father's, a different one, a plain green government-issue notebook she used strictly for documentation, and wrote down the date, the time, the posted score, and the name of the officer who had signed the evaluation. She had been here less than 96 hours. She was already building a paper trail. The second week introduced what the instructors called environmental shooting conditions, which was a bureaucratic way of describing scenarios specifically designed to make accurate shooting feel impossible. Wind holds at unknown ranges, moving targets, simultaneous engagement, 2 threats, 1 round each, 3 seconds between triggers. Night conditions with degraded optics. Elena moved through the sequence methodically. She wasn't the loudest candidate in the class. She wasn't the most vocal during the post-exercise critiques, but she asked precise questions at the right moments, questions that demonstrated she had already absorbed the material before she asked and was now pressure testing the edges of it. 3 other candidates noticed this. They started gravitating toward her during the informal discussion periods, not obviously, not in a way that drew attention, but consistently enough that she began recognizing the pattern. Hale noticed it too. On the 9th day, he announced a schedule modification. An additional obstacle component had been inserted into the day's evaluation sequence. The modification was presented as a course-wide change. It affected 1 candidate. At 07:30, while the rest of the class was moving directly to the live fire staging area, Elena was directed to the back lot, a rougher course, longer by approximately 400 meters, with a final ascent over a wall obstacle that hadn't been part of anyone's preparation. By the time she reached the staging area, the first relay had already shot. She was marked late. She shot anyway. Her performance was still competitive. She could feel it, the way you could feel a good performance even when conditions were wrong, the way a musician knew a run had been clean before anyone applauded, but the lateness penalty would suppress her ranking regardless. She went back to her notebook that night. She wrote it all down. Dates, times, names, deviations from the posted schedule, discrepancies between observed performance and recorded scores. Every small thing that would have looked like paranoia to anyone who hadn't been watching what she'd been watching. She had 9 documented incidents in 9 days. She submitted the first formal report on day 10. R.S. Sergeant Pollard found her before breakfast on day 11. He didn't look comfortable. He was holding a copy of her report the way people held things they wished they hadn't been handed. "You filed this last night," he said. "Yes." "Through the proper channel." "The only channel I have access to?" "Yes." He looked down at the report, then back at her. "This is going to create problems." "I imagine the conduct documents has already created problems," she said. "I just put them in writing." He started to say something, then stopped, then tried again. "The CO has a way of making things difficult for candidates who document what they observe." He closed his mouth. The look on his face was not unfriendly. It was something more uncomfortable than that. It was the look of someone who knew she was right and was trying to find a way to tell her that without saying it out loud. "Watch your equipment," he said finally. "All of it. Every day." He walked away before she could answer. She stood there for a moment, turning that over. Watch your equipment, not a threat. Not a warning to back off. A different kind of warning entirely. She went directly to the armory, Taz. The scope was a Night Force ATACR, and it was good glass. She had trusted it since day 1. She had confirmed its calibration twice. She knew it's 0. She knew the way the turrets felt under her fingers. She broke it down that morning with more care than usual. The external housing came off cleanly. The internals looked standard until she got to the erector assembly, the mechanism that physically moved the reticle when the shooter adjusted elevation and windage. Seated between the erector tube and the body of the scope, barely visible against the machined aluminum surface, was a thin piece of metal. A shim. It was machined precisely, not rough or improvised, but cut to fit. Placed correctly, it would create a consistent and nearly imperceptible shift in the reticle's true 0 versus its displayed adjustment. At 500 meters, the effect would be small enough to blame on the shooter. At 1,000 meters, it would make the shot miss cleanly every time. She did not remove it immediately. She photographed it first with the small camera she kept in her kit, the old film kind her father had given her that didn't require a memory card or connectivity of any kind. Then she removed it. Then she documented everything and locked the documentation in the bottom of her bag beneath her extra boot insoles, inside an old sealed envelope that had no identifying marks. She reassembled the scope. She zeroed it again from scratch. She did not tell anyone what she had found. Not yet. The third week brought the 1,000-meter qualification. This was the first genuinely long-distance evaluation of the course, the first range at which the difference between a competent shooter and an exceptional one became visible in ways that couldn't be explained away or attributed to wind variance or shooter nerves. At 1,000 meters, you either understood external ballistics or you didn't. You either had the patience to let the rifle settle or you didn't. 14 candidates shot before Elena. 5 hit, 9 missed. The misses were instructive. Most of them were called shots. The shooters could feel their errors in the trigger press, that slight anticipation before the round broke that sent the impact low and left. The instructors ran the target flags and marked each one without comment, which was its own kind of commentary. Elena was the 15th shooter. She settled into the prone, confirmed her rear bag, adjusted her cheek weld until the scope image centered perfectly without any muscular pressure. She read the wind indicators, flags at the 300, 600, and 900 meter marks, and watched them for 90 seconds before she began her firing solution. At 1,000 meters, the bullet was in the air for slightly over 1.5 seconds. In that time, it dropped more than 45 feet from its departure angle, drifted with any crosswind it encountered, and began to slow significantly through its transonic phase. The math was not complicated. The patience was. She fired. The instructor at the target radioed back in 3 words. "Cross, dead center." A sound moved through the assembled candidates on the line. Not quite a reaction, more of an exhalation, the kind that happened when something confirmed what people had been privately suspecting. She heard it and kept her eyes on the range. She fired her second and third rounds, both dead center. That afternoon, the official scores were posted. She was ranked 7th, 7 out of 14 shooters who had hit their targets. which was mathematically impossible given that only 5 of the 14 who shot before her had connected, and she had hit all 3 of her rounds center mass. She stood in front of the board. She wrote down the numbers. She submitted her second formal report that evening. The response came back within 48 hours, routed through a duty officer she had never spoken to, delivered in a sealed envelope that contained exactly 1 page. The page stated that her reports had been received, that the matters described were being reviewed at the appropriate command level, and that she should continue to perform her duties in accordance with the course requirements. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in the envelope with her photographs. That night, sitting on the edge of her bunk after the barracks lights had been switched to red for the rest period, she opened her father's notebook. Not to read anything specific, just to feel the worn leather cover in her hands, to smell the faint pine and machine oil that had never fully left the pages no matter how many years had passed. Her father had been a soldier, not in the same way she was, a different era, a different war, a different theater of operations, but the same fundamental thing. He had never told her to be a soldier. He had never pushed her toward the military. He had just taught her how to be still when everything around her was noise, how to see what was actually in front of her instead of what she expected to find, how to wait. He had been patient in a way that she had not always managed to replicate. She was working on it. She closed the notebook without writing anything and set it back under her pillow. On day 19, Captain Mason Cole stopped her outside the mess hall. He was holding something, a folded sheet of paper, and he held it with the specific controlled casualness of someone who had been deciding for a while whether to hand it over. "I want to show you something," he said. Not quietly, just directly. She followed him to the far end of the building, where the exterior wall formed a small alcove out of the main foot traffic. He unfolded the paper. It was a photograph, a still image captured from the security camera mounted on the corner of Equipment Bay 3. The timestamp read, Day 9, 0712. The image showed the backlot obstacle course. And it showed something else. 2 figures in physical training uniforms, both wearing caps, at the far end of the lot. Between them, a stack of additional obstacles, barriers and low walls that weren't part of the posted course layout, had been assembled. The figures were standing beside them in a way that made clear they had just finished constructing something. The figure on the left was turned slightly toward the camera. The figure had Sergeant Pollard's build, his posture. His way of standing with weight shifted to the right. Elena looked at the image for a long time. "How did you get this?" she asked. "I run PT early," Cole said. "I was outside Equipment Bay 3 at 0658. I had my phone because I'd been checking the weather." He looked at the photograph. "When I saw the backlot being modified, I took a picture. I didn't know what it was for at the time." "But you figured it out." "I watched the schedule that morning. I watched where you went and where everybody else went." He folded the photograph again, then held it out to her. "I've been through pipeline selections. Nobody runs a longer course before a qualification by accident." She took the photograph. "You could submit this yourself." "I know." "Why give it to me?" Cole looked at her steadily. "Because it should be in the same file as everything else you're putting together. And because I think you're building something that needs to be complete before it lands." She held his eyes. "You've been watching me document." "I've been watching you not react," he said. "There's a difference. Most people who document complaints are angry about something. You're not angry, you're methodical." He paused. "That's harder to dismiss." She looked at the folded photograph in her hand. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. He nodded once and walked back into the mess hall. She stood in the alcove for a moment longer, listening to the wind come off the canyon and rake across the concrete apron. Then she went inside and ate breakfast, and the photograph went into the envelope, and the envelope went back under the boot insoles. And on day 20, when the morning formation assembled and Colonel Hale stood at the front with his hands behind his back and the cold certainty of a man who had never once doubted his own read of a situation, Elena Cross stood at the end of the second row and waited. She was good at waiting. She had always been good at waiting. The kind of patience her father had shown her wasn't passive. It wasn't resignation. It was the specific, purposeful stillness of someone who understood that timing was everything, that the right action at the wrong moment was just noise, and that she had not come to Fort Blackstone to make noise. She had come to make the only sound that mattered, which was someday the sound of steel. at 1,430 meters, in Red Falcon Canyon, where no shot like it had been made in 32 years. The announcement came on day 21. Colonel Hale delivered it himself, standing at the front of the briefing room with the flat effect of a man who considered drama to be a sign of poor discipline. Week 5 evaluation will include a canyon qualification, he said. Red Falcon, the record distance. He let that settle for a moment. No candidate in this class will be required to attempt the record shot. It is an optional component for those who have qualified in the top 8 of the course to that point. He looked at the assembled candidates. The current ranking stands as follows. He read the names in order. Elena Cross was not in the top 8. She was ranked 9th. She went back to her notebook that night, not her father's, the Green government one, and checked her documented performance against the official rankings line by line. The discrepancies were consistent, methodical, not random error, but systematic suppression, enough to keep her performance visible to anyone paying attention while keeping her ranking just below the threshold that would demand she be given access to the record qualification. She sat with that for a long time. Then she turned to a clean page and wrote a single calculation. If she performed at her actual documented level in each of the remaining Week 4 evaluations, and if her scores were recorded accurately, her ranking would move. If. She underlined it twice. Then she closed the notebook. Then she heard the footsteps in the hallway outside the barracks door. Not rushed, not trying to be quiet, just ordinary footsteps stopping outside her door and then moving on, which was unusual at 22:30 because the corridor should have been empty at this hour. She listened to the footsteps until they faded completely. Then she got up and checked the door. On the floor just outside, someone had slid a single folded piece of paper under the gap. She picked it up. It was a printout of the course's formal grievance procedure, the chain of command above Hale, the contact information for the installation's inspector general, and a handwritten note at the bottom in printing she didn't recognize. It said, "Your reports reach someone who reads them." She stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then she looked down the empty corridor in both directions. Nothing. She folded the paper and went back inside. Outside, the canyon sat in the dark the way it always did. Massive, indifferent, full of wind she hadn't measured yet. And somewhere in the darkness of Red Falcon Canyon, at 1,430 meters, a steel plate waited between the cliff faces the way it had waited for 32 years. Patient, cold, certain of nothing. Just like her. She read the note 3 more times before she slept. Your reports reach someone who reads them. It wasn't reassurance. It wasn't a promise. It was just information, delivered without signature or context, and she turned it over in her mind the way she turned over a misread wind call, examining it from every angle, looking for the error in her interpretation, refusing to settle on a conclusion until the evidence supported one. Someone above Hale had the reports. That meant someone above Hale was paying attention. Whether that attention would translate into anything useful was a different question entirely, and one she couldn't answer lying on a bunk at 2300 with the wind scratching at the windows. She slept 4 hours. It was enough. Morning came in hard at Fort Blackstone the way it always did. Cold air off the canyon, the smell of exhaust from the generator building, boots on concrete before the sky had fully committed to daylight. Elena was at the range by 0440, 20 minutes before the first instructor arrived, and she spent those 20 minutes dry firing from the 500-meter berm with her rifle empty and her scope tracking imaginary targets along the ridgeline. Dry fire was something most candidates skipped when they were tired. She never skipped it. Her father had been the one who taught her that the trigger press didn't care whether there was a round in the chamber. The mechanics were the same, the discipline was the same. If you couldn't hold a clean break on an empty chamber, you had no business expecting one under pressure. She had been dry firing since she was 14 years old in her father's garage, tracking a nailhead on the back wall, waiting for the moment when the front sight stopped moving before she let the striker fall. It still worked. She was on her 12th repetition when she heard someone else arrive. Not an instructor. The footsteps were wrong. Too measured, too deliberate. Instructors moved with purpose and noise. Candidates who arrived early moved carefully, like they were trying not to draw attention to the fact that they were the kind of person who arrived early. She didn't look up from her dry fire position. "You're not on the schedule until 0530, said the voice. She recognized it without needing to look. Sergeant First Class Darren Whitmore, one of Hale's senior training NCOs, rangy and sun-darkened, with a permanent squint from too many years behind a spotting scope. He had never spoken to her directly before this moment. "I know," she said. "So what are you doing?" "Dry fire." A pause. She heard him set something down on the bench to her left. A coffee thermos by the sound of it. "You do this every morning?" "Most mornings." Another pause, longer. She finished her repetition, set the rifle down, and sat up. Whitmore was watching her with the expression she had come to associate with people who had just revised their estimate of something. "How long?" he asked. "Since Fort Intaid." He looked at the rifle, then at her. "Your father?" "Yes." He picked up his thermos and walked toward the instructor station without saying anything else. But she noticed when the first relay of candidates arrived at 0530 and Whitmore ran the line brief, that he positioned himself at the end of the line closest to her lane. He didn't say a word to her during the exercise, but he watched. Week 4 began with what the posted schedule described as integrated field evaluation, a compound exercise combining land navigation, communication protocols, and precision engagement across a 3-phase sequence that ran from 0, 600 to 1800. The candidates were split into 2-person teams for the navigation and communication phases, then consolidated for individual marksmanship at the end. Hale posted the team assignments himself. Elena was paired with a candidate she had barely spoken to, Specialist Raymond Garza, 27 years old, infantry background, good physical numbers but mediocre precision scores. He was one of the 8 who had looked eager in the first formation and whose eagerness had since curdled into something closer to anxiety. He met her at the staging point at 0555 with his kit in good order and a look on his face that suggested he had been up since 0300 worrying about the pairing. "Your cross," he said. "Yes." "Okay." He adjusted his pack. "So, I've heard things. Most people have. They say Hale has it out for you." He looked at her sideways. "That true?" She checked her compass against the first waypoint coordinate. "Stay on pace and watch the terrain. There's an elevation change in the second leg that isn't on the topo." He stared at her for a moment. "How do you know that?" "I ran the approach road yesterday evening." She started moving. "Come on." The first 2 waypoints went cleanly. Elena set the pace and Garza matched it, which she respected. He didn't try to lead, and he didn't drag. They communicated in short bursts, the way soldiers who didn't know each other well defaulted to. Functional, specific, no wasted words. At the 3rd waypoint, they were supposed to establish radio contact with the instructor element and report their position using the current day's authentication codes. The radio they'd been issued crackled on the first transmission. Static. She adjusted the squelch, still static. She checked the battery pack. Full charge. She checked the frequency. Correct. She keyed the handset again and said clearly, "Blackstone Control, this is Cross Garza element at waypoint 3. Authentication November 7. How copy? Over." Static. She tried twice more. On the 4th attempt, a voice came back. Not the instructor element. Another candidate team, somehow transmitting on the same frequency. She looked at the radio's frequency display. Someone had changed it. Not by much, 1 digit off from the designated net, but enough to knock them off the communication phase entirely. The change was recent. The digital display still felt slightly warm from being handled. Garza was looking at the radio. "That's not our frequency." "I know." "Did you?" "No." She reset the frequency, keyed the handset. "Blackstone Control, Cross Garza element, waypoint 3, authentication November 7, over." This time the response came back immediately. The instructor's voice was flat and official. "Cross Garza, Blackstone Control. You are 17 minutes past your communication window. Penalty noted. Continue to waypoint 4. She acknowledged and clipped the handset back to her shoulder strap. Garza watched her. 17 minutes. That's a scoring hit. "Yes." "Somebody messed with our radio." "Yes." He stared at her. "You're going to write it down, aren't you?" She was already writing it down. They finished the navigation phase in time despite the penalty, came into the consolidation point for the marksmanship phase with their legs burned out and their water running low, and took their positions on the line with 30 other candidates who had completed the navigation element in varying states of coherence. Elena's lane was lane 12. She had shot from lane 12 twice before. She knew its characteristics: a slight leftward slope to the bench surface that created a minor but consistent cant issue if you weren't watching for it, and a wind shadow from the berm on the right side that made the first 100 meters deceptive before the terrain opened up and the full crosswind became relevant. She settled in. Garza was at lane 13 to her immediate right. She ran through her preparation systematically, confirmed zero, checked her dope card against the current conditions, read the wind indicators, set her rear bag. Around her, the sounds of other candidates doing the same thing filled the line. Bolt handles cycling, turrets clicking, the dry mechanical snap of safety selectors coming off. Hale was behind the line. She could feel him there the way you felt weather coming. A change in the atmospheric pressure of the space, a specific quality of attention that had direction and weight. She did not look back. She fired her qualification strings. 3 rounds at 300, 3 at 500, 2 at 800. Clean hits. Her group at 300 was under an inch. Her hits at 800 were both center mass with a spread she estimated at under 4 inches. When the instructors walked the line to score, Whitmore stood at her target for a long time. He didn't say anything. He wrote something on his clipboard and moved on. That evening, the integrated field evaluation scores were posted. Elena's combined score, accounting for the communication penalty, put her at 11th place. She stood at the board. Cole appeared at her left shoulder without announcing himself. He looked at the rankings, then at her score, then at the communication component. 17-minute penalty, he said. Yes. How? Frequency change. Someone adjusted the radio before we picked it up at staging. She didn't look at him. It's documented. Of course it is. He was quiet for a moment. That's not an accident. Changing the frequency is a deliberate action. Someone had to handle your kit. Kits are stored in the open equipment bay overnight, which means access isn't controlled. He looked at her then. You need to submit the radio issue as a separate report, not bundled with the scoring discrepancy. She looked at him. Why separately? Because bundled reports look like someone trying to build a case. Separate reports look like consistent documentation of independent incidents. He paused. There's a difference in how those get read upstairs. She turned that over. He was right. The distinction was subtle and entirely correct. You've done this before, she said. Not a question. I had a situation in my second posting, different circumstances. He looked back at the board. The paperwork is what survives when everything else disappears. She went to her bunk and wrote 2 separate reports. The next 4 days felt like weather building. The course mechanics continued normally. Range days, physical evaluations, classroom instruction on external ballistics and atmospherics. But underneath the routine, something had shifted. The candidates who had previously treated her as background noise had stopped doing that. Not because they had become her allies, but because they had been watching closely enough to notice that the pattern of obstacles assigned to her specifically was too consistent to be random variation. Soldiers noticed patterns. It was what they were trained to do. At dinner on day 25, 3 candidates Elena had barely spoken to sat down across from her at the mess table. One of them, Sergeant First Class Tara Briggs, a communications specialist with close-cropped hair and the economical physical efficiency of someone who had spent years working in tight spaces, set her tray down and looked at Elena directly. I want to ask you something, Briggs said. Go ahead. The radio at waypoint 3 during the integrated eval. The frequency. What about it? Briggs leaned forward slightly. My team's radio had a similar issue. Different component. Our squelch was set wrong. Cost us 12 minutes. Elena set down her fork. Did you document it? She asked. I mentioned it to Sergeant Whitmore at the end of the exercise. Briggs paused. He didn't seem surprised. The second candidate at the table, Corporal James Osei, a slight man with wire-frame glasses that looked out of place over his otherwise combat-worn face, cleared his throat. Mine was a kit issue, wrong ammunition type in my assigned pouch, standard ball instead of match grade. I caught it before I shot, but it cost me time. He looked at Elena. I assumed it was an honest logistics mistake. Did you still have the mismatched rounds? She asked. I turned them in at the end of the day. He paused. As mislabeled equipment. Good. She picked up her fork again. That's a record. The third candidate, a staff sergeant named Kowalski, who hadn't spoken yet, was watching her carefully. You're not surprised, he said. By any of this? No. Why not? She looked at him. Because when the same type of issue happens to multiple candidates in the same training cycle under the same command, it's not a logistics problem. The table was quiet for a moment. Briggs spoke. So what do you do about it? What I've been doing. Elena looked at each of them in turn. Document everything. Dates, times, names, specific deviations. Don't combine incidents, don't editorialize, just facts. She paused. And keep shooting. Osei nodded slowly. You've done this before, too. She thought about it. Different circumstances, she said, which was true. Same principle. She found Cole in the armory that evening. He was at the same bench as the first night, running a boar snake through his rifle barrel with the patient repetition of someone who had been doing this long enough that it had become less a task and more a form of thinking. She sat down across from him and set her own kit on the table. Briggs and Osei had equipment issues during the integrated eval, she said. He looked up. How bad? Enough to suppress their scores, not enough to be provable on its own. She began breaking down her scope. But combined with everything else, the pattern is clear. To us, Cole said. The question is whether it'll be clear to whoever is reading your reports. Depends on who that is. True. He went back to the boar snake. There's something I should tell you. She waited. I know someone at the installation's IG office, he said. Not a friend exactly. We went through SFAS together. He washed out on week 3 and ended up in administrative law. He paused. I've been in contact with him informally. Not about this course specifically, about the procedure for reporting systemic evaluation irregularities. She looked at him. How long have you been doing that? Since day 12. He held her gaze. You'd filed 2 reports by then. I could see they were going nowhere, and I wanted to understand why. What did he tell you? That reports filed through the unit chain get reviewed by the unit chain, which means they get reviewed by people who report to Hale. He put the boar snake down. The direct route to the IG bypasses that. It's slower, but it doesn't go through the same filter. I know the direct route, she said. I've been building toward it. I figured. He paused. He also told me something else. Hale has done this before. She kept her hands working on the scope, outer housing off, erector assembly visible, but her attention narrowed. What kind of before? She asked. 3 years ago. A candidate named Sergeant Avery Marsh, female. Strong evaluations, documented scoring issues, filed multiple reports, ultimately withdrew from the course under what the official record calls personal circumstances. Cole's voice was careful and flat. Marsh is currently working a logistics role in Germany. She was one of the best shooters in her cycle, according to people who were there. Elena looked at the components laid out on the cloth in front of her. She withdrew voluntarily? On paper. She was quiet. I don't know what happened to her specifically, Cole said, but the shape of it looks familiar. She picked up the erector tube and examined it under the headlamp. Clean. No shim this time. He's escalating, she said. Yes. Which means he's starting to feel it. Cole looked at her. Or he thinks he can afford to. She considered that. It was a fair reading. Men like Hale didn't escalate because they were panicking. They escalated because they had done this before, and it had always worked before. And they didn't yet understand that the current situation had a different variable in it. The variable being that she was not Avery Marsh. Not because she was better, not because she was stronger, but because she had come to Fort Blackstone with a specific body of knowledge about what patients could accomplish, and what documentation could build, and what the right submission, in the right format, to the right office, at the right moment, could do to the kind of certainty that had never once been seriously challenged. She reassembled the scope. She recapped the elevation turret and confirmed the click values with her finger. I need to be in the top 8, she said. You're ranked 9th right now. I know where I'm ranked. She looked at him. I need to be in the top 8 before the week 5 announcement. If my actual performance gets recorded accurately in the next 2 evaluation sequences, I get there. If, Cole said. Yes. She began repacking her kit. The question is whether that's possible here. Cole was quiet for a moment. Whitmore was watching you today. On the line. I noticed. He's not the same as the rest of them. No, she agreed. He's not. She zipped her kit and stood. Get some sleep, she said. He nodded. You too. She walked back to the barracks through the cold night air, past the equipment bays and the weapon lockers and the permanent smell of gun oil and dry-cleaned canvas that was Fort Blackstone's specific signature. The canyon was invisible in the dark, but she could feel it to the west. The mass of it, the depth of it, the specific silence that came off terrain that had been carved by water and wind across a time scale that made 32 years feel like nothing at all. 1,430 meters. She had done the math. She had studied the atmospherics. She had read Dayton Rourke's original After Action on the shot, obtained through a Freedom of Information request she had submitted 4 months before she'd applied to the course. She knew what the shot required. What it required was not impossible. What it required was patience, and a clean record, and a ranking that put her on the line when it mattered. 2 of those 3 things were in her control. The third depended on what happened in the next 48 hours. The next morning, the duty board outside the main training building had a new notice posted at 0500. Elena read it on her way to the range. The Week 5 record qualification, it said, had been moved up by 3 days due to a scheduling conflict with an incoming exercise. The new date was in 72 hours, which meant the remaining evaluation window, the window in which her ranking could move, had just been compressed from 4 days to 1. She read the notice twice. Then she went to the range and dry-fired for 20 minutes. The final week, 4 evaluation was a compound precision exercise, unknown distance targets at ranges between 400 and 1,200 meters, identified only by a milling exercise at the start, scored on hits and time. It was the kind of evaluation that rewarded everything she had been building toward: patient preparation, solid fundamentals, controlled breathing, the ability to do math under a clock. She arrived at the staging point to find her lane assignment changed, not by much. Lane 8 instead of lane 12. The difference was that lane 8 sat at the far western end of the line, where the range berm stepped down and created a different wind environment than the rest of the shooting positions. A more exposed position, where the full canyon crosswind arrived without the shelter of the elevated terrain that protected the central lanes. It was a harder shot from every target. She set up anyway. She read the wind for 90 seconds before the evaluation began. Flags, vegetation movement, the way dust kicked off the berm surface in small eddies. And she built her firing solutions with the harder conditions factored in. The exercise began. She milled the first target, a standard silhouette at approximately 600 meters. Math confirmed it. She dialed, settled, fired, hit. The second target was smaller, a reduced steel plate at roughly 900 meters, partially masked by a terrain feature that cut the visible surface to about 60%. She spent an extra 12 seconds on the wind read, which she normally wouldn't have allowed herself. But the canyon exposure at lane 8 created a surface effect that she hadn't seen from any other lane, and she wasn't going to rush a 900-meter shot because she was impatient. She fired. The flag at the target line dipped once. Hit. She moved through 5 more targets, ranging from 410 meters to 1,140. She hit 6 of 7. The miss was the farthest target, a narrow plate at 1140, partially obscured with a wind shift that arrived mid-trigger press and pushed the impact right by about 8 inches. She felt the miss before the flag confirmed it, that specific hollow knowledge of a shot that had left the muzzle correct but encountered something she hadn't fully accounted for. She made a note of the wind condition. She didn't make excuses. When the scores were compiled and the instructors ran the evaluation debrief, Sergeant First Class Whitmore led the review for the western lanes. He stood at the front of the small group that had shot from lanes 7 through 10 and ran through each target methodically. When he reached her targets, he paused. Cross, walk me through your approach on target 6. It was the 900-meter plate with the terrain obstruction. She walked him through it. The milling calculation, the wind read, the decision to take the extra 12 seconds, the correction she'd built in for the surface effect at lane 8. Whitmore listened without interruption. "Where'd you learn the surface effect red?" he asked when she finished. "My father was a spotter," she said, "before he was a shooter." Whitmore nodded slowly, not as if he was surprised, as if something had confirmed itself. "Good read," he said, and moved on to the next candidate. That was all. But that evening, when the updated rankings were posted, Elena Cross was ranked 8th. Exactly 8th. One position above the cut. She stood at the board for a long moment, reading her name where it sat at the boundary between the candidates who would be offered the Canyon qualification and the candidates who would not. Cole appeared beside her. "8th," he said. "8th." A pause. "That's where you need to be." "Yes." He looked at the list for another moment. "You earned it." "I know." She turned away from the board. "The question is whether the ranking holds." It was a fair question. The same machinery that had moved her score downward before could move it again. 72 hours was enough time for a lot of things to happen. She knew that. She had cataloged enough of them already to understand the range of possibilities. But 8th was 8th. It was in the record. It was time-stamped. And she had documented the evaluation trail thoroughly enough that any attempt to suppress it further would have to contend with a paper trail that now included not just her own reports, but Briggs's account, OC's equipment record, Cole's photographs, and whatever was sitting in the inbox of an administrative law officer at the installation IG who had gone through SFAS with a captain who didn't waste effort on expression. She went to her bunk. She opened her father's notebook. She looked at the final promise on the last written page, the one she had made standing at his grave 2 years ago, in the rain, with no witnesses and no ceremony, just her and a notebook and the specific conviction that some debts were paid through action rather than words. She didn't write anything. She just looked at it. Then she closed the notebook, tucked it under her pillow, and lay back in the dark with the canyon wind pressing against the barrack windows and the knowledge that in 72 hours she would either be standing on the firing line in Red Falcon Canyon or she wouldn't. And if she was standing there, she would either make the shot or she wouldn't. And if she made the shot, nothing that had happened in the previous 4 weeks would matter in the way Hale intended it to matter. It would matter differently. It would matter permanently. She lay there thinking about her father's voice. Not any specific thing he had said, just the sound of it, the patience built into the cadence of it, the way it never rose when the situation was hardest, until her eyes closed. She slept 6 hours. When she woke, the canyon was still dark outside the window. The wind had shifted. She lay still for a moment, listening to the new direction of it, reading its character the way her father had taught her. Not with instruments, not yet, but with the particular quiet attention of someone who understood that wind didn't lie. It was coming from the northeast now. That was new. She filed it away and got up. The northeast wind was still running when the sun cleared the canyon rim 3 hours later. Elena had tracked it through the pre-dawn dark and into the pale gray of early morning, watching it from the barracks window while she laced her boots, then from the path between the buildings while she moved to the mess hall, then from the mess hall window while she ate. Not obsessively, just the way her father had taught her. The way you kept a peripheral eye on a patient you weren't sure about, a steady, low-level awareness that didn't interfere with everything else you needed to do. Northeast wind at Fort Blackstone was unusual. The canyon oriented itself along a roughly northwest-southeast axis, which meant the prevailing winds, the ones all the course material was calibrated against, the ones baked into the standard dope cards, and the range estimation exercises, and the qualification standards, ran parallel to the canyon's length. A northeast wind crossed that axis. It came from the high desert plateau above the eastern cliffs and descended into the canyon in a way that created layered thermal effects at different elevations, which meant the wind you felt at the firing line was not necessarily the wind that existed 2/3 of the way to the target. She had read about this in the meteorological survey of the installation she'd obtained before arriving. She had flagged that section. She had thought about it on and off for 6 weeks. She ate her eggs and thought about it now, and when Garza sat down across from her, uninvited, the way he always did now, having apparently decided at some point during the integrated eval that they were on terms that permitted this, she was still thinking about it. "You look like you were doing math," he said. "I am." "In your head?" "Where else?" He ate for a moment. "Rankings are up. I saw you made 8. "Yes. That's the cut." "Yes." He looked at her. How are you feeling about the canyon thing? She considered the question honestly. I don't know yet, she said. Ask me in 72 hours. He nodded, and they ate in the specific silence of two people who had been through enough together to find it comfortable. The 3 days before the canyon qualification had their own rhythm, a suspended, pressurized quality, the way the air felt before a storm that everyone could see coming and nobody could do anything about. The regular training schedule continued: morning PT, range maintenance, classroom ballistics. But the substance of the days had changed. Everyone was either preparing for the canyon or watching the people who were preparing for the canyon. And the watching had a different quality than anything that had come before, because this was the evaluation that defined the course, the one that would be in every candidate's permanent record regardless of what else happened. 8 candidates were in. Elena was 8th. The ranking had not changed since it was posted. She had checked every morning. Hale had not moved it. She wasn't sure why. Cole had a theory, which he shared on the second morning in the armory during what had become their informal daily debriefs at the cleaning bench. He can't move it now without making the manipulation obvious, he said. The ranking is public. Everybody's seen it. If he drops you below the cut at this stage, he has to justify it with something. He's been justifying things all along, she said. Poorly. And the reports are stacking up. He paused. I think he knows the IG office has the file. She looked up from her scope. You think he knows? I think he's acting like someone who has started to feel the edges of something. Cole picked up a cleaning rod. He hasn't spoken to you directly since day 21. She thought about that. He was right. Since the canyon announcement, Hale had not addressed her by name, had not singled her out in formation, had not manufactured any new obstacles she could specifically trace back to his direction. The equipment issues and scheduling modifications had stopped. The day had begun to run for her the way it ran for everyone else. That could be tactical, she said. He could be waiting. He could be, Cole agreed. Or he could be trying to create distance. She went back to the scope. Outside the armory window, the northeast wind was still running. She could see it in the movement of the range flags, a slight northeast lean, flags straightening and dipping in a rhythm that was different from the standard crosswind pattern she'd spent 6 weeks learning. What do you know about the canyon's wind history? She asked. Cole looked up. In terms of? Northeast flow. How it behaves at different elevations in the canyon. The layered thermal effect. He considered this. Not much. The course material covers the standard prevailing conditions. Northeast is mentioned as an anomalous pattern. 2% of shooting days annually, according to the installation weather records. She put the scope down. Rourke made his shot in November. I checked the historical weather data. The predominant wind on that date was southwest, 15 to 20 knots, favorable for his approach angle. Cole was quiet for a moment. The qualification is in 2 days. Yes. And you're worried about the wind. I'm not worried about it, she said. I'm thinking about it. She looked at the range flags through the window. There's a difference. The night before the canyon qualification, Hale called a final briefing. All 23 candidates assembled in the main classroom, the 8 going to the canyon and the 15 who were not, because Hale ran briefings the way he ran everything else, which was to say that the information belonged to the group and the group watched each other receive it. Elena took a seat in the 3rd row, between Briggs and a candidate named Sergeant First Class Ewan, who had qualified 6th and who had the specific economy of movement that Elena associated with people who had been through sniper school before. Hale stood at the front without notes. Red Falcon Canyon, he said, 1,430 meters, steel plate, 45 centimeters by 60 centimeters, suspended on a static mount at the far end of the canyon between the secondary cliff faces. He let a beat pass. Current record stands at 1 confirmed hit in 32 years of qualification attempts. That record belongs to this course and to the soldier who made it in 1992. It has not been equaled. He looked at the 8 candidates in turn, moving his gaze slowly across the row. You will each be given 3 rounds. You will be scored on confirmed hits. A single confirmed hit earns full qualification credit. 2 hits is noted on the record. 3 hits has never been done. A brief pause. The evaluation begins at 0700. Standard firing order will be posted outside this room at 2100 tonight. Weather brief is at 0600 tomorrow. He paused again. This time his gaze landed on Elena. It stayed there for 3 seconds. long enough to be deliberate, not long enough to constitute anything formally provable. Any candidate who is not prepared to shoot at qualification standard should inform the duty NCO tonight rather than waste the range time tomorrow. He held her gaze for one more second. This is not an exercise in aspiration. It is an exercise in capability. He walked out. The room took a breath. Briggs leaned over. Did he just suggest you shouldn't be there? He suggested it to everyone, Elena said. He was looking at you. He looks at a lot of things. She picked up her notebook. Doesn't change what happens tomorrow. Briggs watched her for a moment, then nodded slowly. No, she said. I suppose it doesn't. 2. The firing order was posted at 2100. Elena was 7th out of 8 candidates, which meant she would shoot after everyone else. After the line had been worked, after the targets had been engaged and missed or hit, after every instructor and every candidate and Hale himself had had the maximum possible opportunity to observe and evaluate and form their conclusions. It was the kind of placement that could go two ways. Either the pressure of being last became debilitating, or the information gathered from watching everyone else became an advantage. She stood at the board, read her name in the 7th slot, and went to bed. She slept without difficulty. The morning of the canyon qualification arrived cold and clear, with the northeast wind still running at between 8 and 12 knots at ground level. She checked the anemometer reading outside the weather station before the 0600 brief and wrote the number in her green notebook. The sky had the specific pale blue of high desert mornings in late season, cloudless, but with a thin haze at the eastern rim that suggested the temperature differential between the plateau and the canyon floor was creating light convective activity, thermal layering, just as she had expected. The weather brief was delivered by a staff meteorologist named Warrant Officer Daniels, who had a dry, methodical manner and a one chart she had clearly printed from the installation's own atmospheric monitoring system. She described the northeast flow as a transitional pattern expected to persist through midday, with speeds at ground level between 8 and 15 knots and speeds at canyon, mid-elevation, potentially different by 4 to 7 knots due to terrain channeling effects. The layer differential, Elena said from the back row. Everyone looked at her. Warrant Officer Daniels looked at her. Yes, the layer differential. Can you specify the estimated transition altitude? The point where the surface flow and the elevated flow diverge? Daniels checked her chart. Approximately 120 meters above the canyon floor, give or take 20 meters depending on thermal activity. Elena wrote that down. Yuen, sitting next to her, glanced at what she was writing. He looked at her. She looked at the chart. What? Red Falcon Canyon in early morning light looked like something that had been painted by someone trying to illustrate what the word immense meant. It was not wide, perhaps 200 meters across at the firing point, narrowing to roughly 80 meters at the far end where the steel plate was suspended. But it was deep, and it was tall, with cliff walls that rose 150 meters on either side and caught the morning light in orange and rust-red bands that shifted color as the sun moved. The canyon floor was broken rock and dry scrub, dropping gradually from the firing line toward the target end and then leveling out across the final 300 meters. Wind moved through it in visible layers. At the floor level, dust and scrub moved with a northeast lean. Higher up, where the canyon walls began to taper, the movement was subtler, a kind of shimmer in the light that was harder to read but present if you knew what to look for. Elena stood at the canyon mouth for 15 minutes before the evaluation began. She wasn't looking at the target. She was looking at the canyon. She was watching the dust at floor level and the shimmer at cliff level and the hawk that had been riding a thermal above the eastern wall since 0720. She was watching the way the morning light touched the canyon walls and where the shadows sat and how the temperature differential between the sunlit and shaded sections created small, predictable updrafts along the base of the east cliff. She was building a picture. Garza appeared at her side. He was not one of the 8. He was there in the support capacity the course offered to non-qualifying candidates, which meant standing behind the line and watching. "What are you looking at?" he asked. "Everything," she said. He followed her gaze to the canyon. "That's a long way." "Yes. 1,430 meters is almost a mile. It's 0.89 miles. He was quiet for a moment. You've been doing the math for a while, since before I got here. He looked at her sideways. Were you always this focused, or did something make you this way? She didn't answer immediately. She watched the hawk make a slow banking turn above the east cliff, riding the updraft with one wingtip nearly touching the rock face. Both, she said. The first candidate, Sergeant First Class Ewan, stepped to the line at 0701. He was good. Elena had known this since the first week. His fundamentals were clean, his breathing discipline was solid, and he had the specific patience of someone who had spent time in environments where the shot window was brief and the cost of missing was significant. He settled into position, ran his pre-shot routine, and fired his first round. The round sailed into the canyon. The radio crackled from the observer position. Miss, slightly low, approximately 3 feet. Ewan made an adjustment, fired his second round. Miss, 1 foot right. He fired his third. Miss, 6 inches right. 3 misses. Ewan sat up from his position, ejected the spent brass methodically, and moved back from the line without visible reaction. But Elena saw it. The small tightening around the eyes, the way he looked at the canyon for a moment before he turned away. Not anger. Something more private than that. The second candidate missed all 3. The third candidate, Briggs, shooting from a sitting position adapted for her build, hit nothing on her first 2 rounds and then, on the third, produced a sound that might have been a hit, but the observer called it a ricochet off the cliff face rather than a confirmed plate strike. No credit. The fourth candidate missed all 3. The fifth candidate, a staff sergeant named Haber, who had been at the top of the class since week 2, hit on his second round. The radio crackled. Confirmed hit. Haber exhaled. A sound moved through the assembled candidates. Not quite applause, more of a collective release of tension that had been building since the first miss. Haber had done it. 1 confirmed hit. Full qualification credit. But only 1 out of 5. Elena was running numbers as she watched. 4 misses out of the first 5 candidates, 1 hit, and the pattern of the misses was telling her something. The majority were going right, not consistently, but predominantly rightward, which in a northeast crosswind suggested the wind at the elevation of the steel plate was actually running harder than at ground level, and the candidates were undercorrecting for it. The hold they were dialing in, based on ground level conditions, wasn't enough. The plate sat at approximately the canyon mid-elevation, right in the zone where Warrant Officer Daniels had described the transition between the surface flow and the elevated flow. They were shooting through the boundary. They were measuring the wind at ground level and applying it at mid-elevation, and the mid-elevation wind was 4 to 7 knots faster. She took out her green notebook and did the arithmetic for .338 Lapua at 1,430 meters. At this range, a 4-knot wind air was the difference between center and miss. 7 knots was the difference between miss and the cliffside. She looked at the canyon. The hawk was still there, riding the east wall thermal. She watched it. The sixth candidate missed all 3. Hale, standing 20 feet behind the firing line with his hands behind his back, said nothing. He had said nothing since the qualification began. He watched each candidate, made no visible reaction to either misses or the 1 hit, and occasionally looked at his watch. Elena stepped to the line. She set up her kit, rear bag positioned, rifle laid out on the sandbag, bipod deployed and adjusted to her cheek weld height. She had done this 100 times. She did it now without thought. The way her hands knew the motions, the way the setup had become less a sequence of decisions and more a single unbroken action. She loaded 3 rounds. She pressed the first round into the chamber, closed the bolt, confirmed safe. She lay down behind the rifle and looked through the scope. The steel plate appeared in the optic as a small gray rectangle suspended in the canyon's shade. At this magnification, 25 power, she could see the mounting hardware and the slight movement of the plate in the wind, a periodic shimmer from side to side, maybe 3 or 4 centimeters of arc. She watched it. She read the wind indicators along the canyon. The flags at the 400-meter mark were leaning northeast at approximately 8 knots. At 700 meters, the flag was leaning more aggressively. She checked the cliff face vegetation through the optic. At the cliff base, scrub grass showed movement consistent with the surface reading. 40 meters higher, where the vegetation clung to the rock in sparse tufts, the movement was faster. 11, maybe 12 knots. She checked the plate again. Its oscillation was telling her something. Not just the direction, the frequency of the swing. The plate was a pendulum, responding to the dominant wind at its elevation, and the frequency of its swing suggested the true wind at that height was closer to 12 than 8. She dialed in her correction. Not the correction for 8 knots, the correction for 12. Behind her, she heard Hale move. A shift of weight, the slight crunch of gravel under a boot. She did not respond to it. She looked at the canyon. She was looking for the specific moment. Not a break in the wind. There would be no break in the wind today. The northeast flow was stable and committed. She was looking for the periodicity, the rhythm of the thermal cycle on the east wall, the cycle the hawk had been showing her for the last 40 minutes. The hawk rode the updraft for approximately 11 seconds, then drifted laterally as the updraft weakened slightly, then caught it again. 11 seconds. Periodic. The thermal wasn't constant. It was pulsing, like a slow heartbeat, and during the lateral drift phase, the dominant wind at mid-elevation was momentarily interrupted by the updraft from below, creating a fraction of a second stabilization in the crosswind at the plate's elevation. She watched the hawk. She settled her breathing. She waited. The hawk began to drift lateral. She exhaled. Her finger found the trigger and applied pressure the way her father had taught her. Not a pull, not a squeeze, a press, a gradual, continuous transfer of force that didn't move the rifle, and didn't telegraph the break, and didn't give the bullet anything other than a clean, neutral departure. The rifle fired. The recoil moved through her shoulder, and she stayed behind the scope, watching the canyon, not moving, waiting for the observer's call. 1 second, 2 seconds. The radio crackled. Cross, dead center. She did not move. She did not react. She lay behind the rifle and loaded the second round, confirming the chamber, resetting her position. Her heart was running faster than normal. She could feel it in her fingertips, but her breathing had already started its return to baseline. Behind her, complete silence. She could hear the wind in the canyon. She could hear nothing else. She looked at the hawk. It was riding the updraft again. The cycle had reset, the 11-second count starting over. She waited. She watched. Her rear bag was under her non-firing hand, and she could feel the pulse in her palm now, steadier than before, slowing down. The hawk drifted lateral. She exhaled. Press. The rifle fired. Cross. Dead center again. This time something happened behind her. She couldn't see it, but she felt it. A change in the air quality of the space behind the firing line. The way a crowd changed when something occurred that it hadn't expected to occur. Not a sound exactly. More of a collective stillness that was itself a kind of sound. She loaded the third round. She looked at the hawk. She waited for the cycle. She thought for one moment about her father's notebook under her pillow in the barracks, about the final promise on the last written page, about the specific weight of a debt paid not with words, but with the patient accumulation of everything she had ever learned from a man who had never told her she couldn't and had never needed to tell her she could. The hawk drifted lateral. She pressed the trigger. The canyon swallowed the shot. A full second of silence. Then, cross, third round, dead center. Wow. She unloaded the rifle, cleared the chamber, and sat up. The canyon looked exactly the same as it had before. She stood. She collected her brass, 3 casings off the rock, and stepped back from the line. When she turned around, she understood the quality of the silence she had felt. 22 candidates and 11 instructors were standing in a loose group behind the firing line. No one was moving. Ewan was looking at her with an expression that she couldn't immediately classify. Briggs's eyes were wet, which she was clearly not going to acknowledge. Garza's mouth was slightly open. Cole, at the edge of the group, was still and quiet, watching her with a look she recognized. It was the look of someone who had suspected something and now knew it for certain. Sergeant First Class Whitmore was standing apart from the group, to her left, with his arms at his sides. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the canyon. Then he reached up slowly and took off his cover, his patrol cap, and held it in his hands. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. 3 shots, 3 confirmed center hits. At 1,430 meters, in a northeast crosswind with a thermal layering effect that had made the ballistic solution look like something only calculable in retrospect, in a canyon that had swallowed every attempt at this shot for 32 years. It had never been done 3 times. It had never been done twice. Hale was standing at the far edge of the group. She looked at him. He was not looking at the canyon, or at her, or at anything she could identify. He was looking at a point approximately 2 feet in front of his own boots, with an expression that was completely unreadable, and he was very, very still. The stillness of a man who had just watched something he had structured an entire worldview around, a certainty he had maintained for 22 years, come apart in 3 trigger presses. She walked past him. She walked back toward the staging area where her kit was laid out, and she broke down the rifle with her hands working automatically, and she put each component back in its case the way she always did, and her hands were not shaking, which she was quietly grateful for because she had not been certain they wouldn't. They didn't. She closed the case. She sat on the equipment bench at the canyon mouth, with the morning sun on her back and the northeast wind still running through the canyon, and she thought about the hawk, which was no longer visible above the eastern wall. It had moved on. The thermal had shifted or strengthened, or the hawk had simply gotten what it needed and gone somewhere else. She sat there for a while. Then Garza appeared and sat down next to her, not saying anything for a long time. 3, he said finally. Yes. Nobody's ever... I know. He was quiet again. The wind came through the canyon in a steady northeastern rush, moving past both of them the way weather moved past things that were solid enough to stand in its way. Your father taught you that? He asked. She thought about it. The thermal read, the hawk, the 11-second cycle. The wind correction for a boundary layer she had studied 4 months before she arrived. He taught me how to wait, she said. The rest I figured out. Garza nodded slowly, looking at the canyon. That's kind of the whole thing, isn't it? He said. She looked at the steel plate at 1,430 meters, barely visible in the canyon shade, still swaying in its slow arc. Yes, she said. That's kind of the whole thing. She picked up her case. She walked back toward the main training ground, and Colonel Victor Hale, standing alone at the canyon mouth behind her, watched her go with his cover still in his hand and an expression she would not see and did not need to see because she already knew what it looked like when a certainty died. She had built it. She had watched it arrive, and she had felt nothing about it except the specific, quiet satisfaction of a debt nearly paid. The walk back from the canyon took 12 minutes. Elena knew because she counted her steps, and she always knew her pace rate, and 12 minutes at her standard terrain pace was just under a kilometer, which matched the distance from the canyon mouth to the main training ground staging area. She counted steps the way some people counted breaths, not consciously, not effortfully, just a background process that her mind ran because her father had taught her that knowing where you were at all times, even in familiar terrain, was not paranoia but discipline. She counted 1,247 steps. She did not think about the 3 shots. She thought about what came next. What came next, it turned out, was nothing immediate. The candidates returned from the canyon in their own clusters. The qualifiers and the non-qualifiers intermingled in a way that hadn't happened before. The usual social partition dissolved by the specific gravity of what everyone had just witnessed. Nobody spoke much. Garza walked with her for a while and then peeled off toward the equipment bay. Briggs fell in beside her for the last 300 meters and didn't say anything, which Elena appreciated more than she would have appreciated words. The staging area was quiet when they arrived. Instructors were logging equipment and running the post-qualification paperwork at the folding tables near the armory entrance. Hale was not among them. She scanned the area twice without being obvious about it, and he was simply not present. Not at the tables, not at the briefing room entrance, not on the path between the main building and the parking area. She checked her equipment in, signed the release log, and went to the armory. Whitmore was at the back of the armory at the cleaning bench, running solvent through a barrel with the mechanical patience of someone who cleaned weapons the way other people meditated. He looked up when she came in. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "Sit down," he said finally. She sat at the bench across from him. He kept working. The solvent smell was sharp and clean in the enclosed space. "I've been at this installation for 9 years," he said, not looking at her, looking at the barrel. "I've seen 41 classes come through this course. Full classes, partial classes, special qualification cycles." He pushed the bore brush through again. "Nobody has ever hit the canyon plate twice." "I know. You hit it 3 times." "Yes." He set the cleaning rod down and looked at her directly for the first time. "Walk me through the wind correction." She did. She walked him through the thermal layering analysis, the Hawk observation, the 11-second cycle, the boundary layer correction she had built into her firing solution. She was specific and technical, and she didn't dramatize any of it. Just the mechanics, the data, the reasoning. Whitmore listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for what felt like 30 seconds, but was probably closer to 10. The boundary layer differential, he said. You learned that from the weather data. Before I arrived, yes, and confirmed it during the qualification morning brief. Daniels mentioned it in the brief. She did. Most people in the room weren't writing that down. No, Elena said. They weren't. He looked at the barrel again. Your father was a spotter. Before he was a shooter, yes. What happened to him? She hadn't expected that question from him. She kept her face neutral. He died 2 years ago, non-combat, his lungs. Whitmore nodded once, slowly. He picked up the cleaning rod and went back to the barrel. I had a mentor who died like that, he said. The slow kind. It's harder than the fast kind in some ways. She didn't respond because there wasn't a response that would have improved the statement. It was simply true, and he had said it plainly, and she respected the plainness of it. The report you filed, he said. His voice changed slightly. Not harder exactly, but more careful. How many? 11. 12 if you count the equipment log entry for the radio frequency issue. I know about the radio. He paused. And the scope shim. She looked at him. He kept his eyes on the barrel. I found traces of machining debris on the scope housing during a routine armory inspection, 14 days ago. A pause. I filed my own report, separate from yours, upward of the unit chain. The silence in the armory was very complete. You didn't tell me, she said. No. Why not? He thought about it. Because I wasn't sure yet what I was dealing with, and because your documentation was thorough enough that I didn't want to complicate the picture by adding my name to yours before I understood the full shape of the situation. He set the rod down again. I understand it now. She looked at the wall behind him for a moment, thinking, what did your report say specifically? That physical evidence consistent with deliberate equipment tampering was present on a candidate's assigned scope. That the modification was precise enough to require either specialized knowledge or specialized tools or both. That the nature of the modification was inconsistent with any maintenance or storage incident that could have occurred within normal course operations. He paused. And that the timing of the discovery was consistent with the candidate's documented reports of scoring anomalies. She was quiet. Whitmore, she said. What? Thank you. He picked up the cleaning rod. Don't thank me. I'm doing my job. He began working the barrel again. That's different from doing it because I wanted to help you specifically. I know the difference, she said. He glanced at her. Something moved in his expression. Not quite a smile, more the edge of one, acknowledged and then set aside. Go clean your rifle, he said, and then get some sleep. Tomorrow is going to be complicated. Tomorrow arrived with Colonel Victor Hale's absence from morning formation. His name was on the duty roster. His vehicle was in the parking area. She checked, out of habit, on the way to the mess hall. But when the 0530 formation assembled on the training ground concrete, the officer standing at the front was not Hale. It was Major Diane Forsyth. Elena had not seen Forsyth before. She was taller than Hale, late 40s, with close-cropped silver hair, and the kind of bearing that came not from effort, but from years of being the person in the room who already knew what was going to happen. She wore no rank insignia either, which in this context meant something different than when Hale had done it. Hale had done it to make candidates uncertain. Forsyth looked like someone for whom insignia were a formality she had simply stopped needing. She stood at the front of the formation and looked at the assembled candidates for a moment without speaking. My name is Major Forsyth, she said. I'm the senior training officer for the regional command. I'm here for a scheduled administrative review that will run parallel to your final course activities today. She paused. Colonel Hale has been temporarily reassigned to installation headquarters for a concurrent administrative process. Captain Hendricks will run today's schedule. She stepped to the side. Captain Hendricks, a compact man Elena had seen before in a peripheral administrative capacity, took the front, and began the standard morning brief. Elena did not look around at the other candidates. She looked at Forsyth. Forsyth, for a fraction of a second, looked back. The administrative review, it turned out, was not parallel to the course schedule. At 09:30, Elena was pulled from the range. Not urgently, not dramatically, just a knock on the lane divider from Corporal Watkins, one of Hendricks's assistants, who told her quietly that she was requested at the main training building for an administrative interview. She slung her rifle, collected her kit, and followed Watkins across the training ground. The interview room was the same room used for command briefings. The long table, the institutional chairs, the whiteboard that someone had erased but not well enough. Faint marker ghosts of range diagrams still visible in the upper left corner. Forsyth was there, and beside her was a man Elena didn't recognize. 50s, civilian clothes. The kind of civilian clothes that were too plain and too practical to be accidental. He had a legal pad and a pen, and he sat with the relaxed alertness of someone who did a great deal of listening professionally. "Sergeant Cross," Forsyth said, "sit down." She sat. The man with the legal pad looked at her without introduction, then wrote something at the top of the page. "My name is Forsyth," she said again, which was unnecessary and which told Elena she was doing something official that required the repetition for the record. "This is Mr. Cahill from the Installation Inspector General's office. We're conducting an inquiry under AR 20-1, which covers Inspector General activities and procedures. You are not under investigation. You are a witness and a reporting party. Do you understand that distinction?" "Yes." "Do you have any questions before we begin?" "No." Cahill looked up from his legal pad. "Sergeant Cross, I want to start by confirming that you are the author of the reports filed through the unit training chain between day 10 and day 26 of the current course cycle." "Yes." 11 reports in total. 12 if you count the equipment log entry for the radio frequency discrepancy on day 19. He wrote something. "We count it. 12. He looked at her. "I also want to confirm that you are the individual who submitted a formal grievance package directly to this office on day 22, bypassing the unit chain." She had not told Cole what she'd done on day 22. She had not told anyone. She had driven to the installation's main administrative complex during the late afternoon Liberty window, walked into the IG office, and submitted a consolidated package, all 12 documents, the photographs, a timeline, and a one-page summary, directly to the duty clerk, who had looked at her with the specific expression of someone receiving something they had been told to expect. "Yes," she said. Forsyth was watching her. "When did you decide to bypass the unit chain?" Elena thought about how to answer that accurately. "I decided to use the direct channel when I assessed that the unit chain review would be filtered through the same command authority that was generating the conduct I was reporting." Cahill wrote something. Forsyth leaned forward slightly. "Walk me through that assessment." "The reports I filed through the unit chain received a standard acknowledgement response. The response indicated review at the appropriate command level, which, in this unit structure, means Colonel Hale's superiors within the installation chain, people who work alongside him and have working relationships with him. The reports were not generating action. They were being received and filed." She paused. "The conduct I was documenting was escalating rather than stopping, which suggested the reports were not reaching anyone who was acting on them or were being diverted before they reached that level. Or that the conduct wasn't as serious as you assessed it," Cahill said. His voice was neutral. She looked at him. "The scope shim was a physical artifact. It was photographed in situ before removal. The photography was done with a film camera to prevent any question of digital alteration. Sergeant First Class Whitmore subsequently found machining debris on the scope housing during an independent armory inspection. Those facts exist independent of my assessment." Cahill wrote for several seconds. "The photographs are in the package," she said. "The film has been developed. The prints are in the envelope marked Exhibit C." A brief silence. "I know," Cahill said. "I've reviewed the package." He looked at her again. "Tell me about the Day 9 course modification, the alternate obstacle route." She told him. Dates, times, the performance data, Cole's photograph, the security camera timestamp. She kept her voice even and her language specific. She did not use words like unfair or targeted or deliberate. She used words like deviation, documented, inconsistent, and observable. Cahill filled 2 pages. When she finished, Forsyth said, "One more thing." She folded her hands on the table. "The Canyon qualification yesterday. 3 confirmed hits." "Yes. Walk me through your preparation." She did. The meteorological data, the thermal layering analysis, the hawk observation. She was thorough and precise, and she did not make it sound like anything other than what it was. Careful preparation applied to available information. When she finished, Forsyth was quiet for a moment. "You studied the installation's atmospheric records before you arrived," Forsyth said. It was not a question. "Yes. You submitted a FOIA, request for Master Sergeant Rourke's original after-action report." "Yes." 4 months before you applied to this course." Elena looked at her steadily. "Yes." Forsyth held her gaze for a moment. Then she looked at Cahill, who was still writing. "I think we have what we need for now," Forsyth said. "You may return to the range. We may need to speak with you again this afternoon." Elena stood. She picked up her rifle case. "Sergeant Cross," Forsyth said. She stopped. "The record before yesterday was a single confirmed hit in 32 years. Forsyth's voice was completely professional. "You understand what 3 hits represents. It represents that the shot is reproducible under specific atmospheric conditions if the preparation is adequate," Elena said. "That's all it represents." Forsyth looked at her for one long moment. "That's a very disciplined answer," she said. "It's an accurate one," Elena said, and left. The range felt different when she returned to it. She couldn't have explained the difference in a way that would have satisfied a physicist or a psychologist, but it was there. A quality in the air around the firing line, a change in the way other candidates oriented in her direction when she took her lane position, a slight but perceptible adjustment in the posture of the instructors running the afternoon sequence. She had done something at the canyon that had moved through the course population the way information moved through any closed system. Not all at once, not in a single announcement, but in the specific organic way that things became known when people who had witnessed them began to talk. She was aware of it. She didn't engage with it. She shot the afternoon sequence with the same mechanics she brought to every other evaluation. She wasn't trying to perform, she was trying to shoot. After the range cleared, Ewan fell in beside her on the walk back to the staging area. He was quiet for a while. He had the kind of companionable silence that came from someone who had been an athlete and understood that some things existed before and afterwards and were none the worse for it. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Go ahead." "The boundary layer, the hawk, did you plan all of that before you got to the line? Or did you figure it out while you were waiting?" She thought about how to answer honestly. "I planned the analytical framework before I arrived at the installation. I applied it to the specific conditions on the day. The hawk was useful because it was already doing what I needed to understand." He was quiet for a moment. "I was watching the wrong indicators. The ground-level flags." "Yes. They're the standard reference. The course material is built around them." "But they weren't the right reference yesterday." "No. Not with the northeast flow and the layering effect." He nodded. He was absorbing this the way good soldiers absorbed information. Not defensively, not competitively, just cleanly, as data that improved the picture. "Your father taught you the atmospheric stuff?" he asked. "He taught me the foundation. He was a spotter before he was a primary shooter. He spent a lot of time thinking about what the bullet would encounter between the muzzle and the target." She paused. "He used to say that if you could read the air, the rifle almost didn't matter." Ewan made a small sound that was almost a laugh. "Almost?" "Almost," she agreed. They walked in silence for the last 100 meters. Cole found her at 16:30, outside the equipment bay, with a look on his face that she had not seen before. Not quite urgent, but specific. The focused expression of someone carrying information they needed to pass along before it became outdated. "Hale is at headquarters," he said. "I know." "It's not a routine reassignment. Hendricks told me they pulled him in this morning after Forsyth arrived. He didn't go voluntarily in the sense of he didn't have a choice about the timing." She looked at him. "You spoke to Hendricks?" "Briefly. Hendricks is being careful, but he's not neutral." Cole lowered his voice slightly, not from any real need. They were alone in the equipment bay alcove, but from the ingrained habit of operational discretion. "He told me the IG inquiry is broader than just this course cycle. that there are other incidents being reviewed, other candidates, other cycles. She thought of Avery Marsh, Germany, a logistics role, the official record citing personal circumstances. Marsh, she said. Cole nodded. And at least 2 others, based on what Hendricks implied. He wouldn't give names. She turned that over. If the inquiry was broader than her course cycle, then what she had built, the 12 reports, the photographs, the direct IG submission, had not simply been a record of what happened to her. It had become part of a larger evidentiary foundation that already existed, a foundation built by people who had gone through what she had gone through and either hadn't documented it thoroughly enough or hadn't had access to the direct channel or had simply worn out before they could make their evidence coherent. She had made it coherent. She had made it very, very coherent. What else? She asked. The scope shim. Cole's voice was careful. Cahill asked me this afternoon, separately, about the photograph I gave you, the one from the equipment bay security camera on day 9. He looked at her. He knew about it before he asked. He'd already pulled the full security camera archive from the installation system. What did they find? I don't know everything, but Cahill mentioned in passing. It might have been deliberate, the kind of thing an IG investigator says in passing when he wants to see how you react. That the archive shows additional entries to the armory outside of logged hours. Cole paused. 3 separate occasions in the first 3 weeks of the course, outside of Whitmore's logged inspection times. She thought about the machining debris Whitmore had found on the scope housing, precise enough to require specialized tools. Whoever modified the scope did it in the armory, she said. Yes, Cole looked at her steadily, which means it wasn't Hale personally. Hale doesn't have armory-level access without logging it. But someone who does have that access does. Yes. He paused. Cahill asked me if I had any reason to believe course staff below the CO level were involved in the pattern of incidents I had observed. What did you say? I said I had documented observations and no conclusions. I referred him to your reports. A pause. He said your reports were very thorough. She looked at the equipment bay entrance. There's something else, Cole said. She waited. Forsyth asked to see the full scoring record for the course. Every evaluation, raw scores, not posted scores. He looked at her. Hendricks said Forsyth spent 2 hours with the scoring ledger this afternoon before she met with Cahill. Elena was quiet for a moment. The scoring ledger was the physical record, not the posted rankings on the bulletin board, which were the displayed version, but the actual evaluation sheets filled out by the scoring instructors in real time on the range and in the field. Those sheets had original data. They had the numbers before anyone had the opportunity to translate them into official rankings. If Forsyth had 2 hours with those sheets, she had 2 hours with the gap between what Elena had actually scored and what had been posted under Elena's name. The ledger is the original record, Elena said. Yes. If the posted scores were altered, the ledger shows the original numbers. Yes. Cole paused, assuming nobody altered the ledger. The ledger is in the armory safe. Whitmore controls access. Yes, Cole said. They looked at each other. How long has Whitmore been here? She asked. 9 years, according to him. He was here during Marsh's cycle. Cole was quiet. He filed his own report on the scope, she said, separately, upward of the unit chain. I know, he told me this morning. She looked at the equipment bay entrance again. The afternoon light was shifting, going amber and flat across the concrete. Somewhere in the distance, the canyon was doing what it always did. Sitting in the landscape with a 32-year record that now had a different number beside it, changed not by policy or committee or the kind of slow institutional adjustment that took years, but by 3 trigger presses on a Tuesday morning in a northeast wind. What happens to Hale? She said. Depends on what Cahill finds. Cole's voice was steady. And what Forsyth recommends. That could take months. It could. And in the meantime, he's at headquarters and we finish the course under Hendricks. Yes, she took that in. She was not satisfied by it. She was not the kind of person who confused the beginning of a process with its conclusion, and an IG inquiry was not a verdict, and a reassignment was not a consequence. She knew what the right outcome looked like, and she knew how far away they still were from it, and she was not going to pretend otherwise to herself or to Cole. But she also knew what she had built, and she knew that Whitmore had added his bricks to it, and Cole had added his, and Briggs and Osai had added theirs without even knowing they were building anything, and that Cahill had arrived with a legal pad and 2 hours with the scoring ledger and the full security camera archive, and that Forsyth had spent her morning running a formation that Hale should have been running and had looked at Elena with the kind of look that contained information. "It starts here," she said. Cole looked at her. "Whatever comes next," she said, "it starts from what's already documented. That doesn't go away." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "It doesn't." She picked up her kit. "I need to eat," she said, "and then I need to sleep." She looked at him. "You should do the same." He almost smiled. Almost. You know, most people who just broke a 32-year record would at least take the evening to feel something about it. She considered that. She thought about the notebook under her pillow, the final promise, the check mark she hadn't drawn yet. "I feel things," she said. "I just do it on my own time." She walked toward the mess hall. Hot. Dinner was standard issue. Protein, starch, overcooked vegetables, the specific institutional smell of a mess hall that served 400 people a day and had been doing so for decades. She ate at a table near the window, and she could see the training ground from where she sat, the empty concrete apron in the evening light, the far canyon wall dark now against the sky. Garza sat down across from her without being invited, as was his way. "I heard Hale's at headquarters," he said. "Yes. You think he's done?" She looked at him. "I think that's the wrong question." He chewed for a moment. "What's the right question?" "Whether the people who come after him make the same decisions he made. Whether the structure that allowed it changes." She looked at her tray. "Individual accountability matters, but it's not the whole thing." Garza was quiet for a while. "My sister applied to this course 2 years ago," he said, not looking at her, looking at his tray. "She made it through the screening. She was in the selection pool." He turned his fork over. "She withdrew before the start date, said the timing wasn't right." Elena looked at him. "She never told me why," he said. "I assumed it was personal. Life timing. She'd just gotten married." He paused. "Now I'm thinking about whether that's actually what it was. She didn't tell him what Cole had told her about Marsh. She didn't tell him about the 2 unnamed others. Those were not her facts to share. Not yet, not with the inquiry still running. She said, 'Your sister should know the direct channel to the IG office exists.' He looked up. 'The unit chain isn't the only route,' she said. 'The direct route is slower, but it doesn't go through the same filter.' He was very still. 'I didn't know that,' he said. 'Most people don't,' she said. 'That's part of the problem.' He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face was working through something that had probably been sitting in him for longer than this conversation. "Is that why you're so careful with the documentation?" he asked. "Because you knew it would end up in front of someone who would actually read it?" "I'm careful with the documentation," she said, "because my father taught me that the record is the only thing that survives everything else." Garza nodded slowly. She finished her dinner. At 2100, she was lying on her bunk with the lights out and the green notebook beside her and her father's notebook in her hands. Not open, just held. Someone knocked on the barracks door frame. She said, "Come in." It was Whitmore. He stood in the doorway for a moment, which was unusual enough that she sat up. "Forsyth wants you at 0700, he said. "Main briefing room." "Okay." He didn't leave. She looked at him. "I want to say something," he said. "Not as part of the inquiry, not for the record." "Go ahead." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the wall rather than at her, the way people looked when they were trying to be precise and didn't want the other person's expression influencing their word choice. "I've been here 9 years, he said. "I've seen the pattern before. Not always this obvious, not always this documented. But the pattern." He paused. "I told myself for a long time that it wasn't my place, that the reporting structures existed, and my job was to work within them and trust them to function." He looked at her then. "I was wrong about that. About trusting the structure to correct itself without anyone making it uncomfortable to leave it alone." She held his gaze. "You made it uncomfortable," he said. "Yes." "That matters," he said, "more than the shot." She thought about that. She disagreed, but she understood what he meant by it. and she understood that he meant it sincerely and that his sincerity was informed by 9 years of watching the pattern and making a different choice until he had made a different one. The shot was part of the documentation, she said. It made the suppression visible. You can suppress a score. You can't suppress 3 confirmed hits at 1,430 meters in front of 22 witnesses. Whitmore looked at her for a long moment. No, he said. You can't. He left. She lay back down. She held her father's notebook and listened to the canyon wind, which had shifted again. Back to the southwest now, the standard prevailing direction, the wind the course material was written for. She opened the notebook to the last written page. She looked at the promise. She looked at it for a long time. Then she closed the notebook and set it on the bed beside her and lay in the dark with her eyes open, looking at the ceiling, thinking about 700 and Major Forsyth and what a 2-hour review of an original scoring ledger looked like when it was finished, and someone had to decide what to do with what it showed. She thought about Avery Marsh in Germany. She thought about Garza's sister. She thought about the machining debris on the scope housing and the security camera archive and 3 entry logs to the armory outside Whitmore's hours, and what the name on those logs was going to look like when Cahill's legal pad had finished being filled. She thought about the structure and the record and the specific, unglamorous work of making accountability impossible to avoid. Outside, the canyon sat in the dark with its new number. 32 years. 3 shots. Dead center. She closed her eyes. She slept badly the last 2 hours before her alarm. Not from anxiety exactly, more from the specific restlessness that came when her mind was running calculations it couldn't yet complete, cycling through variables that were still in motion. She woke at 5:12, lay still for 3 minutes listening to the canyon wind, then got up, dressed, and went to the latrine to wash her face with cold water. She looked at herself in the mirror above the sink for a moment. She looked tired. She had looked tired for most of the past 5 weeks. There was a bruise on her left forearm she couldn't fully account for, something from the obstacle course on day 28, probably. And her eyes had the slightly compressed quality of someone who had been running on controlled amounts of sleep for long enough that it had become the baseline. She looked exactly like someone who had been through what she had been through. She turned off the light and went to the mess hall. Major Forsyth was already in the briefing room at 06:55 when Elena arrived. She was standing at the window with a cup of coffee in one hand and a folder in the other, reading something in the folder rather than looking out the window, which told Elena that Forsyth already knew what was outside and had decided the contents of the folder required more attention right now. Cahill was at the table, legal pad open, pen in hand. A third person was present that Elena hadn't seen before. A woman in her 40s in a JAG Corps uniform, colonel's rank, sitting at the far end of the table with her own folder and the contained professional neutrality of someone there in an official legal capacity. Elena sat. "Sergeant Cross," Forsyth said, turning from the window. "This is Colonel Harriet Voss, Staff Judge Advocate, Regional Command. She's present as a legal observer for this portion of the review." Voss nodded once. Forsyth sat down. She put her folder on the table and opened it, but she didn't look at it. She looked at Elena. "I'm going to tell you where we are," Forsyth said. "Not because you're entitled to this information before the process is complete, but because the process affects you directly and because some of what I'm going to tell you requires your response." She paused. "Clear?" "Yes, ma'am." Forsyth looked at the folder, then at Elena. The original scoring ledger for this course cycle shows a consistent pattern of discrepancy between raw evaluation scores as recorded by the scoring instructors in real time and the official posted rankings. Those discrepancies affect 7 candidates over 31 days. The largest and most consistent discrepancies affect 1 candidate. She held Elena's gaze. "Your scores, as recorded in the original ledger, would have placed you first in this class from day 4 onward," Forsyth said. "Not 8th. First." The room was very quiet. The posted rankings were altered after the scoring sheets were submitted and before they were entered into the official course record. The alterations were made in the system used to compile and publish daily rankings. Forsyth's voice was flat and methodical. "We have identified who made those alterations. The access log for the ranking system shows entries by a single user account, at times inconsistent with normal administrative operations. Late evening, early morning, always after the scoring sheets had been submitted for the day. Cahill spoke for the first time. The account belongs to Sergeant First Class Leon Pratt. He served as the course administrative NCO and had system-level access to the ranking compilation software. He looked at Elena. Pratt has been placed on administrative hold as of this morning. She kept her face still. Pratt. She had spoken to him twice, both times about routine administrative matters, kit assignments, and schedule changes. She had not suspected him specifically. She had suspected the system, the pattern, the direction from above that created the conditions in which someone like Pratt did what Pratt did, and she had documented the outcomes without ever having the specific mechanism. The scope modification, she said. Security camera footage confirms that Pratt entered the armory on 3 occasions outside of logged hours during the first 3 weeks of the course cycle, Cahill said. The footage is not detailed enough to confirm exactly what he did during those visits. However, the machining debris recovered by Sergeant First Class Whitmore from your scope housing is consistent with tools present in the armory maintenance station, which Pratt had authorized access to. That's circumstantial, Elena said. Yes, Cahill agreed. He said it without defensiveness, just confirmation. It's strong circumstantial evidence. Whether it rises to the level required for further action is a legal determination. He glanced at Voss. Voss spoke for the first time. Her voice was precise and unhurried. The evidentiary standard for administrative action is different from criminal prosecution. We have sufficient evidence for adverse administrative action against Sergeant Pratt. Whether the scope modification rises to criminal conduct under the UCMJ is still under review. Elena nodded. And Hale. Forsyth looked at her for a moment. Then she picked up the folder and turned to a page near the back. Colonel Hale's involvement is harder to establish in documentary terms, she said. He did not make system entries himself. He did not appear on the security camera footage in the armory. What we have is a pattern of command decisions, schedule modifications, lane assignments, administrative choices that consistently disadvantage specific candidates, combined with a command climate in which a subordinate apparently felt authorized or incentivized to take more direct action. She set the folder down. That pattern is documented in your reports and corroborated by the original scoring ledger and by statements from other candidates and Sergeant First Class Whitmore. Is that enough? Elena asked. It's enough for a formal commander's inquiry, Forsyth said, which has been initiated. That inquiry will determine whether his conduct constitutes an abuse of authority, which carries its own consequences under AR 600-20. A pause. Colonel Hale has been relieved of command of this course, pending the outcome of that inquiry. Elena heard the words. She let them settle. Relieved of command was not the same as disciplined. A commander's inquiry was not a verdict. She knew all of that. She was not going to pretend otherwise. I want to ask about Avery Marsh, she said. Forsyth went very still. She was in this course 2 years ago, Elena said. She withdrew under circumstances the official record describes as personal. Based on what I've learned about the pattern of conduct in this course, I have reason to believe her withdrawal may not have been voluntary in any meaningful sense. A silence. Cahill looked at Forsyth. Forsyth looked at Elena. Sergeant Marsh's course record is part of the broader inquiry. We are aware of her case. Is she aware the inquiry is happening? Contact with former candidates who may have been affected is part of the inquiry process, Voss said carefully. Elena looked at her. That's not the same as yes. No, Voss agreed. It isn't. A longer silence. She should know, Elena said. Whatever happened to her, she should know there's a record now that validates what she went through. She should know she wasn't wrong about what she experienced. She paused. She withdrew because the system made her think withdrawal was her only option. The least the inquiry can do is tell her she was right about the system. Forsyth held her gaze for what felt like a long time. I'll make sure she's contacted personally, Forsyth said. It wasn't a bureaucratic assurance. The way she said it made clear it was a commitment. Elena nodded. One more thing, Forsyth said. She reached into the folder and produced a single sheet of paper. She set it on the table and turned it to face Elena. It was a course ranking sheet, official format, date stamped from the previous afternoon. At the top of the list, Cross E, rank 1. The course record has been corrected to reflect your actual performance across all 31 days, Forsyth said. First in class, highest composite score in the course's recorded history. Elena looked at the sheet. She looked at her name at the top. She had known, mathematically, that this was what the ledger would show. She had done the calculation in her green notebook on the first night she suspected the ranking was being manipulated. She had known it was coming. Knowing it was coming was not the same as seeing it. Her throat did something she didn't allow herself to acknowledge. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was level. Forsyth nodded. "Graduation is this afternoon at 1400, Forsyth said. "We'd like you to be there." Elena looked up. "Where else would I be?" she said. She had 3 hours. She spent the first hour at the range, not shooting, just sitting on the bench at the canyon-facing lane, watching the light move across the terrain. The morning was clear and still, the wind back to its standard southwest run, the kind of day where the atmosphere gave you nothing to argue with, and the shot was as clean as shots got. She wasn't thinking about the shot. She was thinking about Whitmore's words from the night before. That matters, more than the shot. She wasn't sure she fully agreed. She thought they were different things, the shot and the documentation, that mattered in different ways and at different scales. The shot proved something that couldn't be suppressed, couldn't be altered in a system entry by someone with late-night access to ranking software. It put a fact in front of 22 witnesses that existed independent of any record anyone controlled. In that specific sense, the shot was not separate from the documentation. It was the capstone of it, the piece that made everything else impossible to dismiss. But Whitmore wasn't wrong that the documentation was the architecture. Without it, the shot was just a shot. A remarkable one, unprecedented, but without the documented context. The scoring discrepancies, the scope modification, the altered rankings, the camera footage, it would exist in a vacuum. People would be impressed, and nothing would change. The documentation was what made it mean something beyond the canyon. She thought about her father, who had been methodical about everything. The way he cleaned a rifle, the way he kept records, the way he wrote things down even when writing them down felt like an act of faith in an outcome he couldn't see yet. He had believed in the record the way other people believed in things she wouldn't reference. Not blindly, not without evidence, but with a conviction that was based on experience, on having seen, across a long life, that the record was the thing that outlasted everything else. She pulled out his notebook. She opened it to the last written page. She read the promise one more time. Then she took the pen from her breast pocket and drew a small, clean checkmark next to the final line. She closed the notebook. She sat with it in her hands for a moment, feeling the worn leather cover and the weight of it, which was not heavy, but which had always felt heavier than its physical weight in the specific way that things carrying a long accumulated significance did. Then she set it in her lap and looked at the canyon. The canyon looked back with the indifference of terrain that had been there for 10,000 years and would be there for 10,000 more, unchanged and unbothered by the records kept or broken in its shadow. The steel plate at 1,430 meters was invisible from this distance. She knew where it was but could not see it, which seemed right. The target was not the point. The target was never the point. The point was everything you had to become to reach it. Cole found her at the range at 0930. He sat down on the bench beside her without asking, and they looked at the canyon together for a while without speaking, the way people sat together who had been through something and didn't need to name it. "Pratt," he said. "Yes." "I didn't see him." "Neither did I." He was quiet. Hale gave him the direction, or he figured it out on his own. "I don't know. The inquiry will try to establish that." She paused. Maybe Hale never said it explicitly. Maybe Pratt read the climate and made his own decisions about what was expected. She thought about it. That's how it often works. The person at the top doesn't issue orders. They create an environment where certain actions become thinkable. Cole absorbed that. Hale is relieved. "Yes." "Does that feel like enough?" She considered the question seriously because he was asking it seriously and he deserved a serious answer. "Not yet," she said. "The commander's inquiry has to run. The findings have to be stated. The consequences have to be named, and they have to be public enough that they mean something." She paused. "And Marsh has to know." "Marsh?" "From 2 years ago. She withdrew." She looked at him. "Forsyth is going to contact her." Cole was quiet for a long moment. "There are others. Possibly 2 more. Cahill mentioned other cycles. He looked at the canyon. His jaw moved slightly, the small involuntary tension of someone processing something that made them angry and who was choosing to process it rather than express it. All of that has to happen, she said, and most of it will happen slowly and out of my sight. I won't see most of it. She looked at the canyon. But the foundation is there. The record is there. It doesn't go away now. He turned to look at her. You're surprisingly calm about all of this. I'm tired, she said. There's a version of calm that's just tired. He almost laughed. Actually, almost. Yeah, he said. I know that version. They sat in the morning sun until 1000, and then she went back to the barracks to put on her dress uniform. The graduation formed at 1400 in the main briefing room, which had been rearranged for the occasion. Chairs in rows, a small podium at the front, the course colors on a stand to the left. All 23 candidates were present, plus the full instructor cadre, plus 4 officers Elena didn't recognize who had arrived in staff vehicles at 1330 and whom she assumed were from regional command. Forsyth ran the ceremony. She ran it the way she ran everything, professionally, without unnecessary ornament, efficiently, and with a clarity that didn't require volume. She presented the graduation certificates in alphabetical order, which meant Elena was third, which was fine. The certificate had her name and the course designation and the completion date and a line at the bottom for the commanding officer's signature that had been signed by Forsyth rather than Hale, which was not nothing. After the certificates, Forsyth stepped back to the podium. Before we close, she said, there are 2 additional recognitions I want to make. The room went quiet in a specific way. The first is a course record notation. As of yesterday morning, the Red Falcon Canyon qualification record, previously standing at 1 confirmed hit in 32 years, has been updated. 3 confirmed hits, all dead center. The new record belongs to the candidate who finished first in this class. She looked at Elena. Sergeant Cross, please stand. Elena stood. The room moved. Not all at once. Nothing was all at once in her experience. Ewan started it, standing up from the chair 2 rows from the front, and then it moved outward from him like something physical, candidates and instructors rising in sequence, and then all 22 of them were standing, and the sound in the room was not loud, but it was full, the kind of sound that had weight. She stood straight and looked at Forsyth and did not look at anyone else, because if she looked at the room, she was not sure what would happen to her face, and she needed her face to stay neutral for a little longer. Sergeant Cross, Forsyth said, on behalf of Regional Command, I want to formally acknowledge the integrity, discipline, and professional conduct you demonstrated throughout this course cycle, not only in performance, but in process. She paused. You documented what you observed. You used the available channels. You did not deviate from professional conduct under circumstances that would have tested anyone's patience and composure. Another pause. That matters as much as the record. Elena nodded once. She sat down. The room sat down. Forsyth reached to the side of the podium and picked up a small document case. The second recognition is a battlefield promotion recommendation, submitted to Regional Command this morning for advancement to Staff Sergeant with the notation of exceptional performance and demonstrated leadership during a high-stress selection environment. She opened the case. This recommendation has been approved for immediate processing. Sergeant Cross, this is effective as of today. Elena stood again. She was not ready for that one. She stood and she accepted the case from Forsyth's hands, and she shook Forsyth's hand and she felt the slight unreality of the moment, the specific quality of arriving somewhere you had been working toward for so long that when you got there the terrain felt unfamiliar, like walking into a room you had imagined so many times that the actual room could only disappoint, except that this one didn't disappoint. It just felt real in a way she hadn't quite prepared for. She sat down. She opened the case under the table while the ceremony continued and looked at the paper inside. Her name, the date, the grade. Effective immediately. She closed the case. She put her hand flat on the top of it and felt the slight texture of the leatherette cover. Her hand was not shaking. After the ceremony, the candidates dispersed into the specific loose social pattern of people who had been through something together and were beginning the transition toward the separate lives waiting on the other side of it. There were handshakes and quiet conversations and the exchange of contact information with the implicit understanding that some of these connections would persist and some wouldn't, and it was too early to know which was which. Garza found her first. "Staff Sergeant," he said. "Don't," she said, but without heat. He grinned, actually grinned, which she hadn't seen him do before, and it made him look about 5 years younger. "I'm going to call my sister tonight," he said. She looked at him. "Tell her what the direct channel is," he said, "what she might not have known." He paused. "And maybe ask her what actually happened, why she really withdrew. She might not want to talk about it." "Maybe not." He shrugged. "But she should know she can. That's the thing. She should know she can." He looked at Elena. "That's something you did, not just for yourself." She didn't answer immediately. She wasn't sure what to do with that, practically speaking, so she did what she usually did with things she wasn't sure about. She set it aside to think about later. "Good luck," she said. "With the rest of the course, you're going to be fine." "I know," he said. "I had a good example." He walked away before she could respond to that, which was probably intentional. "What?" She found Whitmore at the armory at 15:30, returning equipment. He looked up when she came in and saw the case in her hand. "The promotion," he said. "Yes." "Good." He looked at the case, then at her. "How do you feel?" She thought about it honestly. "Like I need a week of sleep and a functioning kitchen." He made a sound that was the closest thing to a laugh she had heard from him. "That's fair." He went back to the equipment log. "What are you going to do next?" "I don't know yet." She set the case on the bench. "Whatever they assign." "You could stay in the training community," he said. "Your scores and the record notation will open doors." He didn't look up from the log. "There are programs that need people who can do what you did yesterday, not just the shot, the preparation." "Maybe," she said, "or you could go somewhere entirely different." "Also maybe." He looked up. "You're not going to make a decision today." "No, that's probably wise." He went back to the log. "For what it's worth, and you can decide how much it's worth, and I think you'd be effective in a training capacity. Not because you're the best shooter I've seen come through here, though you are." He paused. "Because you know how to wait until the information is complete before you act. That's rarer than the shooting." She picked up the case. "Whitmore," she said. He looked up. "What you filed, your separate report, the debris from the scope housing." She held his gaze. "That was the piece that made Cahill's physical evidence coherent. Without it, the photographs I took were just photographs of a component someone could argue was a manufacturing variation. With your technical identification, it was evidence of deliberate modification." She paused. "I need you to know I understand that." He held her gaze. "I know you do," he said. She nodded once and left. At 16:45, she was sitting on her bunk finishing the last entries in her green government notebook. Not the documentation, which was complete and submitted, but the personal record she had kept in parallel, the one that wasn't for Cahill or Forsyth, but for herself. When she heard boots stop outside her door, she looked up. Colonel Victor Hale was standing in the doorway. He was in his service uniform, not his training clothes, and he looked like a man who had spent the last 36 hours in rooms he hadn't chosen to be in. There were things in his face that hadn't been there before. Not softness, exactly. More like the exposed quality of terrain after a long rain, when the surface is stripped back and what's underneath is visible for the first time. She did not stand. She set the notebook on the bed beside her and looked at him. He stepped into the doorway, not into the room, just to the threshold, and he held his cover in both hands in front of him. "I'm not supposed to have contact with candidates during the inquest." "Inquiry," he said. "I'm bending that rule. I'll accept the consequence of that." She waited. He looked at the floor, then at her. "I had a sister," he said. "Younger. She went through a selection pipeline 18 years ago, combat controller. She was exceptional. The evaluation record said so. She was also—" He stopped, restarted. "She was pushed out, not subtly, directly, by a CO who had decided the program wasn't a place for her and who had the authority to make that decision stick." He paused. "She left the military. She was 26. She spent years thinking she wasn't capable enough, that the assessment was accurate and not political. Elena said nothing. She wasn't incapable, he said. She was outstanding. I knew it. I watched what happened to her. His jaw tightened. And I told myself, for a long time, that what I was doing was different, that I was protecting women from something real, from the attrition rate, from the physical cost, from the institutional resistance they'd face downstream. He looked at her directly. I was wrong about that. I know that now. I think I knew it before, and I built a story around it that let me keep doing it. She sat with that. She was not going to absolve him. She was not going to tell him it was understandable, or that his reasoning had merit, or that the story he'd built had contained any real logic. It hadn't. His sister's experience had produced in him not protective instinct, but the mirror of the thing that had harmed her. And he had administered that mirror to other women for years, with the full machinery of his rank behind it. She was not going to tell him that was complicated. It wasn't complicated, but she also was not going to waste the moment on anger, because anger was a response to an emotion, and what she was feeling was not an emotion, it was a conclusion, and conclusions require different responses than emotions did. Your sister should know you said this, Elena said. He looked at her. Not because it changes what happened to her, she said, but because she spent years thinking the assessment was accurate. If you know otherwise, she should hear it from you. She paused. That's something you can still do. He was quiet. The inquiry has to run, she said. The consequences have to be what they are. I'm not in a position to affect that, and I'm not asking to. She looked at him steadily. But whatever is on the other side of the inquiry, whatever your life looks like after it, what you just told me about your sister is the starting point for something that could still be worth something. He stood in the doorway for a long moment. He looked like a man standing at the edge of something he had been approaching for a very long time and had not expected to reach. You could have made this personal, he said, in how you documented it, and how you handled the inquiry. It was always personal, she said. I kept it professional. Those aren't the same thing. He nodded. He put his cover back on. Congratulations, he said, on the promotion and the record. Thank you, she said. He left. She sat for a moment in the quiet he left behind. Then she picked up her green notebook and wrote the last entry. Date, time, the fact of the conversation, no editorializing, and closed it. She put it in her bag. She picked up her father's notebook, the worn leather one, and slid it into the breast pocket of her jacket, against her chest. She sat there for a while, in the quiet barracks room, listening to the wind. The sun was going down when she walked out to the canyon overlook one more time. She went alone, without announcing it, without a specific reason other than that she needed to see it once more before she left. She stood at the lip of the canyon mouth with the evening light turning the rock walls amber and rust, and she looked at the 1,430-meter distance between where she stood and where the steel plate hung in the shadow of the far cliffs. She could not see the plate from here. She knew it was there. Garza had been right in his way. 3 dead center. That was kind of the whole thing. Not the shots themselves, the 32 years of negative space before them, the accumulated failure of every attempt, the institutional certainty that the record was safe because the record had always been safe. That certainty was what she had actually broken. The steel plate was just the proof. She thought about Marsh, somewhere in Germany, about to receive a phone call she didn't know was coming, from a voice that would tell her that the record of what happened to her now existed inside a formal inquiry, and that she had not been wrong about what she experienced, and that the man responsible was no longer in command of the course that had ended what should have been a distinguished career. She thought about what that phone call would feel like to receive. She hoped it would feel like something. She thought about Whitmore in the armory, running boar snakes through barrels for 9 years, filing one report that had finally been the right report at the right time, beginning the long work of reconciling what he had allowed to continue with what he had eventually chosen to do about it. She thought about Cole, who had handed her a photograph without being asked, and had built something careful and correct alongside her without ever making it about himself, which was rarer than the shooting too, in its own way. She thought about Garza calling his sister. She thought about her father's notebook against her sternum. The canyon was going dark now, the last light pulling back from the rock faces and leaving the space between them in blue shadow. The wind had gone still in the way it sometimes did at dusk in canyon country, not absent, just holding, as if the atmosphere was taking a breath. She stood there until the steel plate disappeared entirely into the shadow. Then she turned and walked back. She packed her kit that night with the specific efficiency of someone who had been packing kits their entire adult life. Clothing rolled, not folded, weight distributed to the bottom of the bag, breakables wrapped in soft items, nothing loose that could shift during transport. Her green notebook went into the outer pocket. Her father's notebook went into the breast pocket of her civilian jacket, where she would wear it on the drive out. The course was done. The inquiry would continue without her presence. Forsyth had given her a contact number before the ceremony ended and told her she might be asked to provide additional statements as the inquiry developed. Elena had taken the number and said she would make herself available. She meant it. At 600 the next morning, she loaded her bags into her truck in the still cold pre-dawn and drove past the administration building and the armory and the equipment bays, past the main training ground concrete apron that still smelled of gun oil and institutional purpose, past the sign at the gate that said Fort Blackstone, home of the long-range qualification course in faded black paint on white. She drove out the gate. She drove east into the early light, with the canyon behind her and the plateau ahead. Somewhere around the first hour, she rolled down the window and let the cold air come in, and she drove with her left elbow on the sill and her hand on the wheel and the notebook in her breast pocket moving slightly with each breath, the way it always had, the way it would as long as she carried it. She did not know yet where the next assignment would take her. She had requests in, preferences noted, and she had the kind of record now that would make those preferences easier to honor. She would find out when she found out. What she knew was what she had always known, and what her father had taught her across a lifetime of early mornings in a garage with a rifle and a nail head on the back wall. The target does not owe you the shot. You owe the target everything you know. You owe it your patience and your preparation and your willingness to wait, through the doubt, through the interference, through the 11 seconds of a thermal cycle in a northeast wind, for the one moment when everything you have built lines up with everything the world is offering. And then you press the trigger. Not because you are certain of the outcome, because you have done the work to deserve the attempt. The plateau opened up ahead of her, wide and pale in the morning light. She drove into it. The ones who tried to break her only taught her exactly how much she could hold.